Nintendo launched the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in America in August 1991. Unlike its predecessor, the NES, the Super NES got off to a roaring start. In fact, despite its late start in 1991, the Super NES lineup for that year features some all-time classics. As the console approaches its 25th anniversary, we'd like to look back at its best releases year by year. How many have you played? Super Mario World. Once upon a time, a new Nintendo console always meant a new Mario game to play on day one. And wow, was Super Mario World a system seller. 1 part tech showcase, 3 parts amazing platformer. Unlike Super Mario 3, which consisted of bite-sized tests of reflex and skill, Mario World slowed the pace and encouraged players to explore more complex worlds full of secrets and tricks. Sega may have poked fun at Mario's leisurely efforts here, but the game holds up incredibly well. A masterpiece both then and now. F-Zero. F-Zero basically existed for one purpose, to show off the Super NES's built-in fake 3D effect, known as Hardware Mode 7. Sure, it seems a little silly now, but before consoles could handle real polygons, the stretched background effect that created F-Zero's futuristic racetracks was about as convincing as visuals got. Back in 1991, this was the cutting edge, blistering speeds, cool graphics, and wailing butt-rock music. Pilot Wings. Really, Pilot Wings was an even more blatant tech demo than F-Zero. Everything in this flight simulator was geared around showing off the Super NES's ability to spin and scale graphics. Again, the visuals have become hilariously dated, but despite that, it's still a surprisingly fun and often challenging trip through the sky, and the surprising twist at the end of the game made for the coolest final level since Solar Jetman. Simcity. Simcity was still a recent creation on Apple II at the time it launched for Super NES, which made this port remarkable on its own. Here was a current PC game being launched alongside the console. But even more impressive was the fact that Nintendo produced this conversion themselves, resulting in the most unique and decidedly Nintendo-centric version of SimCity ever made. UN Squadron. Based on the manga Area 88, UN Squadron got a new name for its US release. But other than that, it was a surprisingly faithful conversion of the arcade original. While critics looked to Gradius 3 as proof the Super NES couldn't handle shooters and other intense action games, UN Squadron proved otherwise. Back in 1991, this was the shoot 'em up to own. Actraiser. Action RPGs were nothing new by the time Super NES launched, but what about action god games? Rather than look to the likes of Dragon Quest for inspiration when adding depth to its first 16-bit action title, developer Quintet instead looked to games like SimCity, using the platforming and combat sequences to punctuate a simple but utterly compelling world simulation revolving around the conflict between good and evil, and the world's growth largely unfolds through heartwarming vignettes about normal people trying to make their lives. So I guess there's a little Dragon Quest here after all. RPM Racing. Before there was World of Warcraft, there was RPM Racing? As you might guess from the name of this racer, the RPM stands for Radical Psycho Machine. This doesn't much resemble the work of Blizzard games that we've come to know and love. But believe it or not, it was the very first game the studio developed under its original name of Silicon and Synapse. RPM Racing is basically Super RC Pro-Am with the same isometric perspective as the NES hit, but more complex track layouts. An arcade-quality racer on a home console. Final Fantasy II. It's hard to believe that one of the most influential RPGs of the 16-bit generation arrived within a few months of the Super NES's American debut, but here we are. Sure, the US version of Final Fantasy lost features, difficulty, and 2 Roman numerals. But even with those compromises and an awful translation, this was an absolute masterpiece. Deftly combining classic Final Fantasy's essence with a highly character-driven story and a brilliant new semi-real-time combat system, this set the standard for every console RPG to come. Super Ghouls and Ghosts. One of Capcom's first ever console game releases was a pretty shoddy version of Ghosts and Goblins for NES. So here's Penance, a vastly superior, not to mention far more feature-rich, 16-bit third entry in the series. But don't take the prettier graphics as a sign of weaker gameplay. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was every bit as difficult as its predecessors. About the only thing bad here was the infamous Super NES slowdown. Super Castlevania 4. And finally, Konami put a capper on the year with a fascinating take on the Castlevania series. Super Castlevania 4 diverged wildly from the original NES trilogy with slower and more complex gameplay. It abandoned the RPG mechanics and multiple playable characters of Castlevania 2 and 3, presenting a more linear quest for a highly capable Simon. He could use his whip as a grappling hook even. With a more methodical play came more muted visuals and music. All in all, perhaps the most unconventional take on classic Castlevania, and one of the most enjoyable. For US Gamer, this has been Jeremy Parrish. Stay tuned for more great videos about games both new and old at usgamer.net and here on our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.